The geothermal generators seem to be running fine, the power storage is almost full. Glad I told them to create that power plant earlier. My workshop won't be able to handle all this magical energy, at least not until I finish this project. There was a geothermal power plant being created and assembled by both the Dwarven Union and the Builders Guild. The dungeon was filled with free heated energy that they could easily harness. This level of power generation was far beyond what the small energy facilities in Roland's workshop could handle, as they had been designed with wind turbines in mind. Now then, I guess it's time to test this one. I sure hope this works. Roland stared at the cracked orb that previously sat on his workbench. Now, it was encased in a metallic sphere and connected to numerous heavy-duty cables. Right next to it was another similar structure, many times larger. This was to become the supercomputer of his pseudo-mage tower. First, he needed to copy over all the data from the monster core into this new vessel and then work out the kinks to get it running. It had already taken him a whole week just to assemble this runic contraption, and he hadn't even started the main task. The sphere that would become the pseudo-mage tower core looked like a complex network of interconnected runes and metallic filaments, arranged in a honeycomb structure. This tower core was quite different from his previous, bulkier creations. Its interior was filled with a lot of empty space, and the filaments were rather thin and fashioned mainly from Ethereum. There was a main reason for this design choice: the thinner metal lining allowed for significantly faster functionality. The delicate filaments and the open structure were crucial for optimizing the speed and efficiency of magical energy transfer and data processing. This design would enable the supercomputer to perform at unprecedented speeds that were essential for the complex calculations and magical operations Roland had planned. It somewhat went against his old knowledge where it was unfeasible to make something that his runes wouldn't burn and deteriorate. However, this was only true for artifacts that were meant for battle. Something like this runic core was not meant for combat or to be moved around. Thanks to its stationary use, it was possible to create a sort of resonance between the runic components and traces. This resonance would keep them from burning through the metal and allow it to reach a certain magical wavelength. As long as it remained inside of the core, it could in theory work indefinitely even for tens or hundreds of years without corroding the Ethereum alloy. At least that's the theory. It doesn't always work out. Roland glanced to the side of the room where a few melted-through honeycomb shapes could be seen. He had spent a few days trying to assemble theory into practice, resulting in several failures. Yet, each failure brought him closer to the optimal design. Roland sighed and wiped his brow. The room was stifling hot, partially from the nearby power unit that was assembled to directly power the workshop core. Roland took a deep breath, calming his mind. This was the most crucial part of the process. If the transfer failed, he would lose a valuable source of data and be set back by weeks, something he couldn't allow. He carefully connected the main conduit between the cracked orb and the new core, ensuring the alignment was perfect. The runes along the conduit started to glow and magical vibrations could almost be felt in the air. Here goes nothing. With a final check of all the parameters, Roland activated the transfer sequence. The magical energy flow began as a slow trickle and the cracked orb emitted a faint light. Gradually, the light intensified, and the filaments of the new core started to shimmer. The data transfer was happening at a molecular level, with the magical essence being carefully copied and imprinted onto the new vessel, which in a sense would become something similar to artificial intelligence. The process was painstakingly slow, but Roland didn't dare to rush it. He monitored every fluctuation, and every pulse of energy, making minute adjustments to keep the transfer stable. A large monitor had been assembled on the side which presented him with a lot of raw data. To most people, it would look like gibberish, but to someone who had mastered runes, it was similar to programming language. Then suddenly, the symbols on the screen became chaotic and it started flashing red. Shit! Something had gone wrong and Roland quickly used his mana senses to examine the problems. His multiple minds went into overdrive as he tried to pinpoint the bug that had arisen. If he failed now, all his efforts would be in vain, and both the monster core and the central tower piece would be destroyed. Come on, the math should have been right, it has to work. Roland muttered to himself while spreading his arms out forward. His control over the runes was immaculate, but even he could make mistakes. He spread out his control and tried analyzing the problem before a meltdown of the core could start. There was a lot of magical energy gathered here, and if it reached a critical point, the whole workshop could collapse in the ensuing explosion, something he could not allow to happen. He focused intently, his mind racing through potential solutions. The runes glowed with an intense, pulsating light as he carefully monitored the energy flow. He adjusted a few of the metallic filaments, hoping to stabilize the core, but it continued. Then he focused on the monster core, which seemed to actually be the problem. It was crumbling on itself. The core can't handle the magical energies and is crumbling. His eyes focused on the monster component of the experiment. He had assumed that this piece would last a bit longer, but that seemed to be a mistake. It was a component he was the least familiar with, but luckily, he had spotted the problem quickly. All the runes were working fine, so he needed to focus on supporting the monster core and not let it crumble before the process was over. I've had enough of everything exploding, just be a good core and stay stable. Slowly but surely, the energy levels began to balance. The once erratic pulses of light in the runes started to synchronize, forming a steady rhythm. Roland let out a sigh of relief, but he knew he couldn't afford to relax just yet. He continued to nourish the core with his own magical energies, which were in tune with it. If he had attempted this process with any other monster component, it would have certainly failed. However, the lich core that had been saturated with his mana pattern reacted quite favorably. Once the immediate threat of a meltdown was averted, Roland took a step back to reassess the situation. The transfer of data had finally finished, and the core that was once the lich finally crumbled into dust. It seemed a bit strange to see it vanish while its essence was transferred into the new mage core. In a sense it was quite poetic, or at least that was what Roland was feeling. You better not try to kill me though. This process remained nerve-wracking. The monster, known as the Purgatory Lich, had once tried to kill him, making his current endeavor of copying its core into the mage tower system quite reckless. It would have been safer to create the tower spirit from scratch, but that would entail fully programming it himself, a task he wasn't entirely familiar with. Perhaps with Arian's help, the project was feasible, but it would likely take him several months to achieve the same effect. Fortunately, he wasn't restoring the monster to its former self. All the data was merely a copy, and the core that made up the monster would remain unused. Many parts of the monster's core were left untouched, deemed potentially dangerous. What he sought were not the lich's personality traits, but its capacity to reason and follow commands. This new magical AI would eventually become a distinct entity. Yet, for now, numerous barriers were in place, restricting access to much of its potential. He couldn't risk this new creation becoming truly sentient and viewing him as an adversary, as it had done in the past. That gave me a scare. With the data transfer completed and the core stabilized, Roland could finally move on to the next phase of the project. After sighting yet again, he began integrating the copied monster essence into the supercomputer, and the creation of the main operating system was now underway. Roland leaned more towards engineering than software development, and he wished Arian was around to handle this task. However, entrusting the creation of a magical tower to others was a risky move. There were always possibilities of errors or other magicians inserting backdoors for later use. While such concerns might not arise with Arian, Roland still needed to understand precisely how this new artifact functioned. If he did not, then he could not really call himself a proper runesmith anymore. The buzz of machinery filled the expansive chamber, signaling the stabilization of the process. Finally, the most fundamental part of the mage tower was in place. Though the artificial spirit serving as the core of his pseudo-mage tower remained dormant, Roland intended to activate it within another week's time. This would afford him approximately one more week to assemble the teleportation gate, and perhaps he wouldn't have to tackle everything alone. Bernier's prosthesis is working fine, perhaps he might be able to help me out from this point forward. Congratulations, you have gained a level. Oh! The world system had taken notice of his success, rewarding him with enough experience to level up again. However, considering the extensive preparation and week-long dedication to the project, the single level gain felt like a minor reward when he counted the hours invested. Moreover, he didn't receive any new titles, as his creation was nothing groundbreaking. Many before him had already achieved the feat of creating mage tower cores. Another possibility dawned on him: his existing title of Rune Savant might already surpass any benefits he could gain from creating a mage tower. Typically, titles had to be earned in order like his Runic Scholar one, but occasionally superior titles could overwrite lesser ones that offered similar rewards. This achievement brought him one step closer to mastering his craft. However, true success would only come once the tower spirit was fully completed and activated. With the successful completion of the initial phase of his Mage Tower project, it was possible to move along with his schedule. For the time being, he decided to run a few tests and programs to see if everything was stable. However, just as he was ready to give the operating system a go, a little tremor shook the place. What was that? It was quite minor, but the sensors he had placed everywhere were made to pick up any types of movement. From the readings he was getting, it seemed that something had exploded outside of the workshop and in an area where a certain individual had their laboratory. Maybe I shouldn't have hired that guy, this is already the third time since he got here. The large screen that he intended to use to monitor the tower core also had access to every camera in the compound. Through it, he could bring up the live feed of what was happening outside. There he saw a slightly burnt gnome running around with his head on fire. Luckily others were outside to help him. If this continues, the repairs to his laboratory will cost me more than the potions he produces. It wasn't the repairs of the building that cost the most, but rather the replacement of the various crafting materials he used. With each explosion, valuable herbs would go up in flames, and all the vials and utensils would need replacing. It was a costly endeavor, perhaps the main reason he had been expelled from the alchemical guild. Likely, after a series of failures, they found themselves rapidly depleting their resources and decided to sever ties with him. Why does he look so happy though? There is something in his hand. After squinting, he accessed a golemic camera that provided a different angle of the item. It appeared to be a large flash with some type of adhesive liquid. Surprisingly, Rastix seemed rather pleased with it, which left him wondering why. Could he have been successful already? Roland had tasked Rastix the alchemist with a singular order: prioritize the creation of something to aid in prosthetic development. The current harness holding the prosthesis together was of poor quality, a major obstacle in its functionality. Excessive movement often caused misalignment and it was too fragile for use during blacksmithing or combat. To address this issue, Roland hoped to devise a solution that would securely adhere to the arm stump without the need for drilling holes. The concept of implanting titanium screws and bolts into people was widespread in Roland's past world. While titanium also existed in his current realm, its compatibility with the body varied and sometimes was rejected by it. Despite superior alloys available, Roland hesitated to perform surgery on his friend, mostly due to his lack of medical expertise. Though he possessed magic for healing wounds, mastering the intricacies of surgical procedures wasn't something achievable in a matter of weeks. Medical knowledge in this world was scarce, with magic and potions serving as the primary means of treating wounds and diseases. Learning such skills from scratch seemed far-fetched, if not impossible. Maybe I should see what he made. His golems were already on the scene, utilizing water magic to douse the flames. With his work on the tower core complete and power flowing smoothly, everything seemed stable. Before further modifications, he needed to let it run for a while. Stress testing such new devices was crucial, and it would be safer if he wasn't present in case of any unexpected explosions. I'll let it run for one day, if nothing changes then I'll move on to phase 2. With his decision made, Roland brought out several runic devices he had previously crafted. They resembled rectangles filled with intricate runes, which he strategically placed around the core structure. Once activated, these devices generated multiple layers of shock-absorbing shields. Even if the core were to explode, his workshop would remain unscathed. The filaments hummed with mana, and Roland could perceive the ethereal pathways forming runes between the components, manifesting as streams of mana. This intricate technique allowed the machinery to endure the excessive energy. All the runes were stored within these ethereal pathways, in the form of proper ethereal runes. It was a new skill he picked up in the Institute which allowed this whole thing to function correctly. With the area secured, Roland made his way over to the elevator, his mind buzzing with ideas for the new Mage Tower project. Although his immediate focus was on creating the teleportation gate system, he knew it wouldn't end there. Once the tower spirit was in place, it would manage all the computing within his workshop. The golems he produced lacked intelligence and required some continuous guidance, a task the spirit should adeptly handle. Thanks to this persistent AI he was trying to grow, a lot of possibilities were opening for his products. In theory, it would be possible to make copies of it or connect to it from a distance. It could eventually encompass the entire city of Albrook and help run its infrastructure. A true city of innovations and runes was becoming feasible, but only if he had enough time to finish everything. Once outside, he was greeted by smoke and the smell of burnt herbs. His mechanical helpers were already on the scene, having managed to douse the flames with their water cannons. To deal with the alchemist's experiments, he had customized a few spider drones specifically for firefighting, a feature that would likely prove useful once his golems were deployed in the city. Rastix. What happened this time? I'll have to start docking your pay if this continues. Roland called out, approaching the gnome who was frantically waving a flask filled with a glowing substance. Success, my friend. I've done it. Rastix beamed, holding up the flask as if it were a precious gem, which caused Roland to raise an eyebrow. Success in what? Causing another explosion. No, no, not that. This adhesive. It's exactly what you asked for. Strong enough to bond metal to flesh without causing any irritation or rejection. It even withstands high temperatures and pressure, it's truly perfection. Is it? Roland glanced at the flask with the liquid. If it was what Rastix was claiming it to be, then it would truly complete this prosthesis project of his. Banner ad, Sword de Fer Apocalypse Dungeon Litter Page User ad. Are you sure about this? Have you tested it properly? Rastix nodded vigorously at the question, almost dropping his prized new creation. Roland raised an eyebrow at the concoction as he was unable to confirm the short man's claim. The gnome looked unusually enthusiastic, a lot different to his usual demeanor since most of his previous experiments had failed. Yes, yes. Well, as much as I could before the explosion. But the preliminary tests were very promising. Here, let me show you, just let me use some of your equipment. Roland wasn't sure about this but was curious about the new creation, so he nodded. The scene of the experiment was clearing up, and the extent of the damage was about the same as always. A hole had been blown through one of the walls, and several alchemical tools were strewn about the charred remains of a workbench. Fortunately, the area was walled off so that even if an explosion occurred, it would be contained. To enter this area, one needed to go through a specific gate that required proper credentials. It was there to keep all the kids that lived nearby from getting injured. He had already installed a ventilation system to take in the fumes as sometimes, they were quite toxic. One of the authorized individuals, Bernier, had also arrived at the scene. He brought his runic prosthesis and was in the process of examining the damaged items. Leave it for now. Let it air out before you start any repairs. Boss, that might be better. It seemed that his assistant had also grown accustomed to these occurrences and was just shaking his head in resignation. The potions he made weren't selling too well either, as his shop couldn't offer a better product than what was readily available in the city. At the moment, they were thinking of pushing potions in bundles with runic weaponry to entice their clients, which was a somewhat successful tactic. All right, Rastix, let's head back to the workshop and see what you've got. Let's just use mine, it's closer. Bernier chimed in, and the three nodded. Soon they were walking, and just as they expected, a few rascals were waiting by the automatic gate to peek at the explosion. The moment they saw the three craftsmen, they giggled and took off running. Roland didn't react much, but it seemed that the kids had started to like him. Previously, many of them were afraid of his gaze, but once he removed the hood and helmet, they saw that he was just a man. Roland led the group to Bernier's workshop, a spacious area that was once an old shed. Once there, he started reminiscing about the good old days when everything was quite peaceful. Back then, it was just him and his assistant, hammering away at pieces of metal. It was a tranquil time, and they spent their days expanding toward a future that had now become reality. Nowadays things were a lot more nosy, with many people running about making all sorts of noise. Hey! To Bernier's shock, Rastix started clearing his workbench which was covered in some tools. They all started hitting the ground with a clang, causing Bernier to wince as his carefully arranged tools clattered to the floor. Careful with those. Some of those are custom-made. Bernier protested, but Rastix was too excited to heed his warnings. My apologies, friend. But there is no stopping brilliance, I promise, this is going to be worth it. Rastix exclaimed, his eyes gleaming with excitement as he placed the flask in the center of the now cleared workbench. After setting it down like some kind of costly artifact, he started to look around. From the tools available, he picked out some scrap metal along with some leather scraps, which seemed to be there to emulate skin or flesh. Using actual flesh for this demonstration would have been better, but no pig legs were nearby. Soon he applied a thin layer of the adhesive to both surfaces and then carefully pressed them together. Almost immediately, the adhesive started reacting with the two materials, forming a bond. Roland used his enhanced eyes to look closer and saw that the reagent was causing both sides to fuse with each other before hardening. As the adhesive cured, the bond between the metal and the leather seemingly grew stronger by the second. However, even though it looked promising from his standpoint, some more tests needed to be taken before they could move on to real testing. Rastix was also aware of this, so he grabbed a hammer and a small chisel to showcase the strength of the bond. After placing the chisel in the middle of the two materials, he started hitting it in an attempt to separate them. To Roland's and Bernier's surprise, instead of the two sides separating, the tool started embedding itself in the leather. Even after the whole chisel pierced through the middle, and after leverage was used, the two sides didn't want to come apart. Roland, who had the most strength, took it into his hand and attempted to separate the two parts, eventually ripping them apart. These bonds are deep. Once the two sides were separated, he could see just how far this alchemical adhesive had gone in. There was a thick bonding layer which was not actually glue but some type of new layer of material formed from the reaction between the metal and leather. It seemed to have somehow melted both sides and combined them together to form some kind of leather-metal mix. Remarkable. Roland muttered while intending to examine this new bond closely. While this was more than he expected in this short amount of time, he couldn't just use this on Bernier without performing multiple tests. What if after a few days or weeks, the bond ceased to exist? Wouldn't parts of his flesh turn into a strange mix of metal that would need to be removed if it failed? Then it could also be rejected by his body and become infected. At this moment, he still had a working elbow with most of his forearm missing, and losing even more due to insufficient data was not something he could allow. It does seem that you're onto something here, but we need to perform some tests. Yes, of course. More tests, that of course means more funding. The gnome beamed with pride, his chest puffing out as he watched Roland examine his creation. A sigh escaped his mouth at the mention of more funding, but if this concoction worked well, then the runic prosthesis would be more complete. A fusion between metal and flesh was normally not possible and no one had really tried to perfect it. This was uncharted territory that probably required a more drastic approach. Should I get a few pig carcasses for him to experiment on, or? Roland didn't want to waste too much time on testing the bonding concoction. From what he knew, people worked on animals before moving on to clinical trials. Bernier was the only real patient here, and even if it worked on dead animals or living ones, it was still not the best option. However, in this world, there existed monsters, some of which were quite close to humans in their physiology. There was no reason to work on animals or humans when there were other options available. All right, Rastix, we'll need to conduct a series of tests to ensure the durability and safety of this adhesive. Once we're satisfied with the results, we can move forward with integrating it into Bernier's prosthesis. Give me some time, I'll have something prepared. Bernier nodded in agreement, and he couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement at the prospect of having a more responsive arm. Throughout the week he had tried getting used to the harness, but it was quite not the same as having a real arm. Can I help with something, boss? Bernier asked as he spotted Roland deep in thought. I'm not sure you'd want to see this. Why wouldn't I? This is about my arm, and shouldn't I know the whole process behind it? I guess you're right about that, but you don't have to force yourself. I'll be fine. Roland was contemplating something unsavory, something that some people from the modern world might consider inhumane. He wasn't sure if this was the right thing to do, but to help his friend out, he was willing to resort to drastic measures. The loss of Bernier's arm occurred while protecting him, and Roland wouldn't rest until he made it right. All right, Bernier. If you're sure you want to see this, then I won't hold you back. But I must warn you, it might be a bit unconventional. Ha, don't worry boss, I'll be fine. Bernier reassured Roland with a laugh, and soon the three craftsmen prepared a new plan. Rastix would give them half of his new product and return to his laboratory. There, he would re-examine it and see if he could improve upon it. He was also tasked with preparing a counter potion that could restore the changed flesh to its former state in case something went wrong. Meanwhile, the other two would head to the city and then Arthur's estate, but before that, Roland needed to make a call. We haven't done this in a while, huh boss? That's true. You really do fit the role. Should I carry your cape for you, Sir Knight Commander? Cut it out. Hee hee. Roland rolled his eyes at Bernier's comments as he had to get changed into his armor. It was a more ceremonial piece with less functionality than his mithril armor, but it still had some good spells on it. The cape that was attached to it shifted around to create a robe that covered his whole body. While he intended to head to Arthur eventually, first the two would need to visit a less savory establishment. Roland didn't want to go there but knew that it was better if he personally handled this to hasten the process. Elydia was there to wave both of them goodbye and the two delved towards the city while Roland attempted to hide his true identity. This was quite hard considering that he was a well-known knight commander and some of the soldiers just recognized the way he carried himself. Nevertheless, after having a few people point their fingers, he along with Bernier ended up in the city pleasure district. Boss, why are we here? If MRS finds out, I'll be in a heap of trouble. We're not here for that, just keep on walking and try not to stare. Bernier seemed to have trouble keeping his gaze away from some of the working ladies. Even though it was the middle of the day, many establishments were trying to entice new customers. It was working, as his assistant was easily drawn by the gazes of half-dressed women and the allure of cheap alcohol. On several occasions, Roland had to pull him back as he was about to walk into an establishment that Armand frequented. Luckily, his idiot brother-in-law wasn't around to ruin everything this time, and the two disappeared through a series of narrow alleyways. They ended up at a nondescript building at the end of a side alley. The sign above the door was faded, but Roland knew it was one of the Thieves' Guild-run places he had called earlier. He was here to seal the deal for a few unconventional goods needed for the next trial on the artificial limb. He knocked on the door in a specific pattern, and after a moment, a small hatch slid open. A pair of sharp eyes peered out at them. Who seeks entrance? An old weary friend in need of a favor. The eyes scrutinized them for a moment longer before the hatch slid shut. There was the sound of heavy bolts being drawn back, and the door creaked open. A tall, lean man with a scar across his cheek stood in the doorway, eyeing Roland and Bernier suspiciously. "Come in, good friend." The man grinned widely at Roland, who had just pronounced the thief's password for this specific location. The man seemed rather docile, thanks to the type of password Roland had offered, one reserved for VIP members, which he was. Once inside, Bernier started fidgeting, as he was not used to seedy places filled with intense-looking individuals. "Just ignore them and follow after me." "Ah, sure boss. We won't be staying long, don't worry, and whatever you do, try not to stare for too long." "What will happen if I stare for too long?" "Not much, you just might get stabbed." "What?" Bernier started sweating and moved closer to Roland as they ventured further into the strange building. They went through another secret entrance that led them to a winding corridor. While people like Bernier were aware of the existence of the Thieves' Guild, most never had the pleasure of wandering through their underground tunnels. This particular tunnel led to a loud place where Roland would retrieve something important. "Yeah, get him." "No, what are you doing?" "I'm going to kill you if you lose." "Haha, I'm going to be rich." Roland tried to ignore the shouts of the people, but they were quite loud. This place looked like some kind of underground arena. People were holding up strange pieces of paper used for betting. In the center was a small ring about 15 meters wide. Inside it, a lone man was fighting against a green monster commonly known as an orc. This place was an illegal fighting ring where betting was allowed, and Roland, as the Knight Commander, was well aware of it. After the last incident with the crime lords from the city, a few agreements with the Thieves' Guild were made. He, along with Arthur, made the decision to allow certain establishments that operated in a grey zone. They were required to pay a fee to continue existing, and as long as they didn't engage in activities like killing, slavery, or selling people's organs, it was deemed acceptable. This compromise was seen as one of the lesser evils for the city. Arthur realized that he couldn't keep expending resources battling the Thieves' Guild and all the criminals. Thus, they decided to work together to a certain degree. As long as they didn't cross certain lines, Arthur and the Knights wouldn't intervene, but this didn't mean they wouldn't step in if the Thieves' Guild made things too obvious. If someone was getting robbed or reported something, they would follow through to clear up the issue. However, if people wanted to waste their money on betting in the pleasure district, then no one would stop them. This might have seemed quite hypocritical considering his recent clash in the Theodore Valerian-run city. However, they ensured that certain thresholds were not crossed, and the Thieves' Guild master was on board with everything. She had promised to keep her guild orderly and would not go out of her way to protect any killers that might wander in from outside. It was somewhat of a necessarily evil, and it was better to keep them in check, than risk another guild forming with a guild master that wasn't willing to cooperate. "If it isn't the honored guest, please come." A man greeted them, appearing a bit out of place with his large belly and fancy attire. He seemed to be the owner of the establishment Roland sought goods from. Alongside Bernier, Roland followed him into a dimly lit room, presumably his office. Two intimidating guards stood behind, though their prowess paled in comparison to Roland's, which they were certainly aware of. The man showed a lot of decorum and his body language was quite submissive. "What brings you to our humble abode, esteemed guest?" "I wish to procure a few monsters from your collection. Do you happen to have any goblins or hobgoblins available?" The man's eyes lit up with interest, and he leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin in contemplation. "Goblins, you say? Interesting choice. We do have a few in stock, though they're not the easiest creatures to come by. How many are you looking to purchase?" "I'll take 2 each to be on the safer side." The man nodded thoughtfully and swiftly agreed to the deal. Roland sensed he might be under pressure from the Thieves' Guild leader he had contacted earlier. With the goblins and hobgoblins now in their possession, the tests could continue further. It took Bernier a moment to realize the purpose of the goblins, but he remained steadfast in seeing the plan through to its conclusion. Good, there will be a few men waiting outside to guide you, follow their instructions while transporting the monsters, do I make myself clear? Of course, good sir. The man smiled content with their agreement, and bid them farewell with a wave. Roland's status exempted them from payment, and soon he was escorted out of the fighting establishment. The monsters would be packed up and transported to the hidden skill training facility at Arthur's estate since, for the time being, Roland lacked a similar place to house them. Once they were delivered and secured, they could proceed with the final adjustments on the runic prosthesis. Quite the interesting gift you've brought me. I apologize, but there wasn't really another facility to use at short notice, Lord Arthur. It's fine, and you can call me Arthur down here. I'm not sure I should. Roland remarked while glancing at a certain angry-looking cat-eared maid. The three of them were watching a group of soldiers transporting goblins and hobgoblins into holding cells. This place was created to hold Tier 3 undead monsters from the dungeon, so managing a few lesser creatures wouldn't be that hard. At this moment they were disabled by a sleeping spell and bound, making it easy for the soldiers to handle them. Bernier was also here, waiting in another room for Roland to come and get him. This place was a secret from most, but his assistant had proven himself trustworthy enough for even Arthur to agree to this. Bernier was already aware of almost all of Roland's secrets, and granting him access to this underground area wasn't really a big security risk. He had not planned this, but there was no similar place to hold monsters in his underground workshop. Roland was planning to create something similar, as improving his skills was important, but he just didn't have the time. Moreover, having Tier 3 undead under his own home, where many young children and his wife lived, would be quite irresponsible. At this location, they had built an extensive underground holding facility that looked like a dungeon, which was perfect for his current experiment. Arthur already knew his true identity, so revealing his latest invention wasn't a significant concern. It was even an opportunity to get him on board with the new invention. If the runic limb was successfully created, the money this city could gain from them was extensive. That is if he could work out a good enough attachment system that could replicate the real thing. If I understood correctly, this research of yours will be quite unsavory. Roland remained quiet and only nodded as Arthur posed the question. He was about to do some inhuman things to these goblins and he was having some second thoughts about the ethical implications. However, his determination to help Bernier regain full functionality in his arm overshadowed his reservations. Arthur observed Roland's struggle by reading his facial expression, which was more tense than usual. Well, they are just goblins, the little buggers would slit our throats without thinking twice. That's true. There was a reason he chose goblins and hobgoblins, as these creatures were considered pure evil. In the past, people had attempted to reason with these creatures or domesticate them, but every attempt had ended in bloodshed. Goblins were notorious for their cunning and cruelty, making them a constant threat to humans and other peaceful races. They liked to torture and play with their prey. To some adventurers, being captured by goblins was a fate worse than death. I understand your dilemma, but you should not look at these creatures as part of the intelligent races. They are nothing more than evil monsters, their minds corrupted by something truly vile. He noticed Arthur trying to give him a pep talk about what was about to happen. It seemed that his noble friend had caught on to his internal dilemma. Roland appreciated the emotional support Arthur was offering and took it to heart. Thank you, Arthur. I'll be fine. All right then, I'll leave you to it. While I'm intrigued by the idea of artificial limbs, I'd rather not stick around, I'm sure you understand. While Arthur was fine with lending the area for his research, he was unwilling to stay and watch. Mary felt the same, and soon only Bernier, Roland, and a few guards stationed here were left. These guards were bound by strenuous magical contracts that would cost them their lives if they leaked any information. All right, let's get this over with. Bernier, are you sure about this? You don't really need to be here for this. I'll be fine, boss. Stop worrying, and not like we'll be doing all that stuff, right? Yeah. The two walked towards the holding area, where one goblin awaited them. While Roland intended to perform some tests with the creature's help, he would not be the one inflicting the pain. He took no joy in causing deliberate suffering to monsters, and these creatures would be also sedated for most of the process. The person carrying out the initial procedure was already waiting for them and was part of Mary's troops. Cutting things was supposedly one of her talents. Well met, Knight Commander. The woman greeted him with a bow, her large black cat ears twitching slightly. Her eyes, brown with a golden tint, peered out from beneath her neck-length black hair, which draped over one of her eyes. This woman was supposedly Mary's right-hand woman, part of a small unit of shadowy maids that roamed this noble estate. They were responsible for Arthur's protection and information gathering. Sometimes, they would be tasked with odd jobs like today, and they usually wore maid uniforms to blend in with the regular people living in Albrook. Did she work for an assassination guild before? Name: Gianna L105. Classes: T2 Nightblade L5. T2 Dagger Rouge L50. T1 Thief L25. T1 Scout L25. Roland took a glance at her true stats, which could not be hidden from his runic eyes. The woman seemed to be treading the path of an assassin. The Nightblade class granted passive buffs to stealth during the night and in dark surroundings. It wasn't particularly effective for combat in the field, but it excelled in surprise attacks. For this occasion, the woman came wearing something more appropriate for the kitchen with a large apron over her uniform. The maid outfit might have seemed unsuited for combat, but it was especially good for concealing weapons. This woman was definitely skilled in her trade, and the sharp knife on the side made her look dangerous. "I'm sure Mary informed you about your task, Gianna." "Yes, Knight Commander. I am to assist you in conducting the necessary tests on the goblins." Gianna seemed to smirk for a moment while mentioning performing tests on the monsters. She was someone he had already been introduced to earlier. From the onset, she felt like a scary individual who enjoyed her job a bit too much. Even now, it seemed as if she was joyfully anticipating slicing some goblins apart. Roland didn't care as long as the woman didn't point her knives in his direction or toward the people he knew. "Good, now I'll need you to make the incision on the right forearm, the same as it's here." He pointed to Bernier, who was remarkably quiet. It seemed his friend could feel the bad air around the knife-wielding maid and had become rooted out of fear. Bernier was still only a blacksmith, and some battle classes exuded a certain aura that would cause normal people to shrink back in fear. "Right forearm, got it." The maid nodded, her eyes glinting with a strange luster as she delved into the room where the goblin was being held. She approached the goblin, which was lying unconscious on a metal table, its greenish skin covered in warts and filth. The stench emanating from the creature was repugnant, but she didn't seem to care. Roland moved forward and turned around after noticing that his assistant was not moving forward. "You can stay outside if you want, Bernier. Don't force yourself." "Hey? I'm not forcing it." Bernier's voice wavered slightly as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the closed door behind which Gianna was preparing to perform the procedure. Despite his attempts to appear composed, Roland could see the unease written all over his friend's face. However, he was a man with his own convictions and would not back down once his mind was set. "I'm fine." "Good, here, wear this then, it will help with the smell." Roland was wearing his secondary half-plate armor with a helmet, which would protect him from the fumes. What he handed over was more of a face protector than a mask. It covered both his mouth and eyes and resembled a modern gas mask, with the filters replaced by a runic enchantment that purified the air. Bernier gratefully accepted it and put it on, trying to steady his nerves. With the mask in place, they entered the room where Gianna was already at work. The goblin was securely restrained, and Gianna had already started making precise incisions on its forearm. The creature twitched slightly but remained unconscious, thanks to the powerful sedative they had used. Roland watched closely as Gianna, with one quick slice, severed the entirety of the monster's lower arm. Once the arm was gone, Roland sprang into action. His hand hovered over the monster's bleeding limb, and the healing process began. His pseudo-divine spells had become even more potent than before, reaching levels quite close to what advanced priests could achieve. Even though this monster was considered evil, it was not undead, so healing its flesh could be done through regular holy spells. The light from Roland's spell enveloped the goblin's severed limb, and within moments, the bleeding stopped. Flesh began to knit itself back together, forming a smooth, scarred surface where the arm had once been. The goblin remained unconscious, oblivious to the rapid regeneration taking place. While he had the power to restore wounds like this, it would be impossible to restore the whole limb without a Tier 4 variant. "Will this do, Knight Commander?" "Yes, this will be enough, I'll take it from here." The woman nodded but seemed disappointed that the procedure ended with just one severed monster limb. Goblins had a body structure similar to humans and were a great analog for his prosthetic research. Now, Roland needed to use Rastix's concoction to see how well it reacted with actual flesh before attempting to use it on Bernier. If it only attached itself to a few layers of skin, it would be quite useless, as it would probably tear off eventually. This world was a bit different from the one he came from, and not everything made logical sense. There were perhaps ways to magically anchor the prosthetic limb to the body, which he also needed to examine. First, he needed to see how this flesh glue worked. If it connected well to skin, bones, and muscle, then it could potentially be viable. This goblin was here to test all the ratios, and if the initial tests were successful, he planned to bring Rastix over for some advice. The first round of tests was quite simple as he attempted to attach a hastily produced metallic sleeve. He applied the concoction to both the metal and the goblin's arm before creating the connection. Using his magic, he carefully constricted the metal to push it closer to the green skin. Once they were close enough, the bonding reagent took hold of it and the two began to fuse. The metal and flesh began to meld together, forming a seamless connection. Roland carefully observed the process, noting the changes in the goblin's skin and how it reacted to the adhesive. The bond seemed to be forming deeply, as it had with the leather and metal earlier, but this time it was penetrating living tissue. After a few moments, the process appeared to be complete and the metal sleeve was now securely attached to the goblin's arm. Roland used his various skills and runic magic to examine this new bond, and on the surface, it looked very promising. The adhesive was sticking well and seemed to have penetrated deeper than just the skin. He could foresee some issues with a connection like this and knew that further modifications to the sleeve would be necessary. However, this was just the first test, and many more goblins were being prepared for further experimentation. Next, Roland conducted a series of strength tests. He pulled, twisted, and bent the metal sleeve, but it remained firmly attached. Even when he applied a fair amount of force, the bond held. However, it had its limits, and eventually, he saw blood flowing from the connection, prompting him to quickly heal the wound. Remarkable! He muttered while rubbing the bottom area of his chin. The alchemical adhesive was performing beyond his expectations, but he knew that a single successful test wasn't enough. He needed to ensure the long-term viability and safety of the bond. We'll need to observe this goblin for a few days and see if this bond remains stable and doesn't cause any adverse reactions. Is that so? But Knight Commander, wouldn't it be a waste to not use the other arm? Don't you need more tests? You do make a good point. Giuna chimed in while holding something resembling a cleaver now. He wasn't sure where the woman got it, but she seemed eager to delimb the goblin from the other side. Considering they were still in the beginning trial phase, the goblin wouldn't really need any of its arms as it wouldn't live much longer. The hobgoblins were meant for the end phase while the lesser goblins were quite expandable. Bernier shifted nervously beside him, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of further mutilating the helpless goblin. Roland shared his discomfort, but he knew that sacrifices had to be made in the pursuit of progress. With a heavy sigh, he reluctantly nodded to Giuna, indicating that she could proceed with removing the goblin's other arm. Giuna wasted no time, swiftly bringing down the cleaver with a precise strike. The goblin's other arm was cleanly severed, and once again, Roland sprang into action to heal the wound. The process repeated, with Roland using a slightly different sleeve shape this time around. This should be enough for now. I have enough data for now. As you wish, Knight Commander. The cat maid carted the goblin into a separate chamber where it would be observed by runic cameras. Other monitoring devices were also included to measure any adverse effects of the operation. With this task completed, Roland needed to return to his workshop and work on variations of the prosthetic sleeve that he planned to create as a permanent limb attachment. Once created, the prosthetic would be connected to it as a separate extension. He envisioned a modular solution for the runic limb. Despite the runic components being able to function on Tier 2 metals, they would eventually burn through them. It would be preferable if they didn't need to repeat the connection procedure each time the artificial limb needed replacement. For this reason, he wanted them to be two separate parts, as he wasn't sure if Rastix's adhesive could be restored back into flesh once it had gone through the bonding process. You feeling fine? Boss, don't worry about me, I've seen worse things when I was younger. Roland nodded at Bernier, who managed to keep his food in this time around. The half-dwarf had spent his life as a porter for adventurers before becoming a full-time blacksmith. Thanks to this experience, he had witnessed monsters and adventurers being torn apart inside the dungeons. The tests were over for today, but his work was far from finished. Both of them left the underground facility and headed back home. They parted ways in the city as night had already fallen, and Bernier headed to his own home where his wife was waiting for him. Roland did the same, knowing that the process of moving the orphans had been fully completed during his stay at the Institute and Elydia was probably waiting. How was it? Once back, she greeted him with open arms and a smile on her face. They retreated to the dining area where luckily no kids were running around. All of them stayed at their dorm area during the night with some of the older kids looking over them. It went better than expected. If things continue like this, then Bernier will have his hand back. Elydia nodded, her expression turning soft as she noticed the slight excitement on Roland's face. That's good to hear. I'm sure you'll be able to do it. The two exchanged glances and started moving closer, but suddenly, a loud noise resounded from the side in the form of some munchkins riding an oversized sunlight wolf. Awoo! How many times have I told you to stop riding Agni? But he likes it. Worf. Two boys, around the age of 6, were clinging to Agni's mane and being loud outside. Elydia leaned out of one of the windows and started shouting at them. Roland just chuckled and took this as a chance to slip away to his workshop. While he had made some progress with his research, the prosthetic limb was not the only project he was supervising. He needed to check up on his tower spirit and perhaps start tinkering with some of its features. I suppose having friends in high places has its merits. Two craftsmen were attaching some heavy cables to a large platform. One was quite tall with a height of 193, something he had achieved after his Tier 3 rank trial. It was a phenomenon known as post-ascension growth and sometimes occurred to accommodate drastic changes to one's body. Luckily this growth had already stopped and now Roland could focus on the task at hand. What's that, boss? What do you think it is? Roland asked while holding something that resembled a monocrystal, something they used in bulk to treat alloys to get higher quality products. Bernier eyes this peculiar-looking crystal that was strangely pink and elongated. Soon, the crystal made its way into a special container that had been prepared on top of a workbench. The container looked quite advanced, with a glassy outer case that allowed them to see the floating crystal inside. It was shaped like a tube with various runes inscribed on the bottom and top of the cylinder. The glass, on the other hand, was covered in traces that pulsated from time to time. Inside, an intricate gridwork of thin mana threads connected to the crystal through ethereal pathways. Is it some kind of magic crystal? Maybe a compressed one? But there is no smelter here, so probably not. Not even close. Roland replied with a small chuckle, knowing it wasn't something his assistant would recognize. It was an item gifted to him by Arian, his friend at the institute. While it looked like an elongated crystal, it was actually more akin to a storage device for data. Though it appeared semi-transparent, slicing it apart would reveal many tiny runic traces and compact runes inside. Through this complex array inside, a lot of data could be transferred and connected to other runic devices, like the ones they were building in this underground workshop. It's something like a basis for the Mage Tower core I'm making, but also contains the code for the transferal gate. Is something wrong? Bernier seemed a little out of it as Roland started explaining the item and its use. It seemed that his friend was having a hard time understanding any of it. Bernier's eyes glazed over as Roland explained the intricacies of the crystal and its purpose. Despite his considerable skills as a blacksmith and craftsman, the advanced magical theories and concepts often left him feeling out of his depth. Roland noticed his assistant's blank expression and realized he might need to simplify things a bit. Think of it as a blueprint. Roland said as he tried to make the explanation a bit more simple. This crystal contains all the information we need to build and operate the gate, as well as a simplified basis for the Mage Tower core. Once we assemble both, the Tower Spirit will take control of the calculations for us and will help us connect with other gates. The teleportation gates in this world worked on a sort of handshake basis. Knowing the right coordinates wasn't enough for the connection to be established, both sides needed to confirm their existence, making intrusions from outside impossible. If one wanted to forcefully open a gate, there were ways, but typically someone needed to alter them from the inside. Otherwise, they would be rejected by various safety features like mana barriers and teleportation scrambling magic. I see, I think I get it. Good, now let's start the process. Both of them nodded as they prepared to start the process of activating the Tower Spirit. The core, which would serve as its brain, had been reinforced with several layers of metal. From the outside, it now looked like an icosahedron, more commonly known as a 20-sided die in a certain popular game from his old world. It was a special alloy that included orichalcum, which would help manage all the magical energy in the vicinity. It also gave the tower core lining a similar luster to gold and shifted THA mana coloring along with it. Alright, Bernier. Let's begin with the core. Help me place those containment rods around it. Aye, boss. While Bernier was still only using the unfinished prosthetic, it allowed him to work quite well. He couldn't place much weight on it, but when it came to grabbing and moving his digits, it was quite human-like. The two craftsmen began slotting in 5 large rods that fit into specially created sockets around the core. Once inserted, the rods started to fold upwards and connected with the ceiling. A pentagram appeared on the floor, with these rods acting as focal points. As their name implied, these rods were a safety feature for what they were trying to activate. If, for some reason, the tower spirit went berserk, the rods were designed to contain its power and shut it down. The pentagram generated a powerful shield that could theoretically contain power close to Tier 4. They would also activate in the case of any explosions and outside intrusion. Some special spells and devices targeted mage tower cores and they needed to be defended against. Everything seems to be in order, I guess this is it. The time for activation was upon them and Roland activated the pink crystal. It began to glow with a soft pink light and Roland took a step back. He glanced at the display that recreated screens from his old world and made things a lot easier to read through. On it, he had already fashioned a graphical interface that would allow others to see the whole process. It seemed stable enough. It was quite a sight to behold. The runes on the crystal's surface flickered to life and everything shimmered with magical energy. Within moments, the crystal's energy connected with the tower core, initiating the process of awakening the tower spirit. The core hummed with power, resonating with the magical frequencies emanating from the crystal. Slowly, but steadily, the workshop began to vibrate as the data transfer took place and the tower spirit was being created. There were many types of tower spirits that could be created, ranging from simple constructs with basic intelligence to complex magical beings capable of interacting with their surroundings. Roland had chosen to create a more advanced spirit, one that could assist him in his research and help manage the various magical devices in his workshop. However, he did not want it to have an ego of its own, as it was a variable that could complicate matters. The more complex the spirit was, the bigger the probability of it developing an ego of its own. Sometimes, these beings were just monsters made of energy that could run wild. He was not making a conversation partner but a machine to manage his underground workshop and for calculation. He wanted something more similar to an AI assistant and not a magical beast with its own mind and feelings. As the process continued, Roland monitored the energy levels carefully, ensuring that everything remained stable. The runes on the core's casing continued to pulsate, and eventually, the process reached its conclusion. For a moment, the air crackled with power, and a strange burst of energy erupted from within the tower core. Quickly, the containment array reacted to block this surge of energy, causing Bernier to jump back in fright. Whoa! It's fine, the mana can't get through the shield, you'll be fine. Whew, that gave me a scare. Bernier chuckled and stood back up, his eyes focused on the focal point of the core chamber. Meanwhile, Roland, able to see through the casing, observed the magical reaction taking place within it. He witnessed the birth of the tower spirit and the formation of its shape. Soon, it floated forward, depicted as an orb of light slightly larger than a tennis ball. So this is it, the tower spirit? He asked himself while examining the pale blue ball of light. It didn't look like much and could probably be mistaken for a Tier 1 spell that produced light. However, once he identified it as the tower spirit, he felt a sense of satisfaction. This small, unassuming orb contained vast potential and was proof that he had reached a higher point in his crafting profession. Greetings, Master. The ball of light floated forward at a slow pace. Initially seeming a bit confused, it eventually turned in the direction of its creator. Once there, it greeted Roland in a somewhat monotone voice that reminded him of old text-to-speech technology from his own world. This was his tower spirit, an artificial intelligence created from many months of work and a build-up of knowledge. Greetings. Roland replied and was greeted with silence. Bernier on the side rubbed his nose a bit and then shrugged as if he didn't know what to say. Tower spirit? Do you know what your purpose is? My purpose is to assist my master. Right, are there things that you must not do? Yes, master. Could you list those things? Roland replied, realizing that this artificial spirit he had created was quite passive. It was like a newborn baby, eagerly awaiting to absorb information. Luckily, it was following the main directive he had implanted inside of it. He needed to ensure that it would not attack him or the people he was affiliated with. This wasn't anything new, as all artificially created beings usually followed some type of rules. It was a safeguard employed by any self-aware inventor to prevent it from ever being able to attack him. The tower spirit paused for a moment, processing Roland's request. Then, it began to list the restrictions placed upon it. I must not harm my master or those under his protection. I must not divulge sensitive information without authorization. I must not interfere with my master's personal affairs unless requested to do so. I must not act against the interests of my master. Roland nodded as the spirit continued to list down the constraints it was under. Some people like to include orders to never harm humans under any circumstances. However, this AI spirit would be allowed to control many of his battle golems and tower defensive systems in his workshop. It could not operate without being able to use deadly force in this world of strife. What he already created was a database with people's names and mana fingerprints, that his creation would not be able to harm instead. I should give it a scan. Name. None. Species. Artificial spirit. Roland examined his new creation, but his identification didn't reveal too much, but it made one thing clear: the world saw this orb of light as its own species. It was an artificial spirit that he had created, and it still lacked a name to be considered a full-fledged tower spirit. Roland's naming sense wasn't too great, and he had already given his armor the runic naming scheme. He strained his brain for a moment and then came up with the genius idea to give this new assistant of his a name fit for a butler. I suppose we need to give you a name. Artificial spirit or tower spirit won't do. How about Sebastian? Registering a new name, this spirit will be known as Sebastian. You have gained a new title, Arcane Craftsman. You have gained a new title, Spirit Bond. Once the name was given, a sudden system window appeared before him, rewarding him with not one new title but two. It seemed that creating a mage tower core alone was not enough, fashioning an actual artificial spirit was required for a new title. To make things even better, he received an additional title for naming his AI butler. Arcane Craftsman. Title. A title gained by craftsmen who have reached the pinnacle of arcane artistry. Mana usage inside any arcane structures will be lessened and affect all magical devices within range of the arcane structure. Spirit Bond. Title. Given to people who have created a bond with a spirit. Arcane structure. I guess it means the mage tower core in this case. Roland would be able to lower his own mana usage even further when near the mage tower core. This title meant that whenever he was there, he would have a home advantage against other casters. He wondered if it would affect things like his golemic army and his armor. The other title was typically given to summoners who contracted actual spirits, but it appeared to be something that could also be gained with an artificial spirit. I wonder if I'll be able to gain a summoner class with that title. For a moment, he imagined casting a spell during combat and his workshop appearing to aid him. Summoning typically involved using other creatures and even magical constructs, which could be called from the spirit realm. However, he wasn't sure if his artificial spirit would be allowed to traverse the spirit realm. This thing sounds funny, boss. Unidentified individual spotted, trying to identify mana pattern, individual identified as Master Bernier, clearance level 4. Master Bernier. Bernier was confused by the terminology that the artificial spirit named Sebastian was using, but Roland was here to explain. I've included you in the ARTI. Sebastian's database. He should listen to your orders, and with your clearance being 4, it's going to be only one notch below mine. Just below yours, boss. Roland nodded as Bernier was taken aback by the level of trust he was given. The 5th level was the highest and only he could access it. Bernier, with his 4th level clearance, had access to a lot, but he was not the second in command. Elydia, his wife, was next in line, and if something ever happened to Roland, she would be automatically given full authority over everything. Nevertheless, this was quite the blow to Bernier, whose eyes widened in surprise. Thanks, boss. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Bernier, but not like there is much this clearance will give you, at least not until this spirit is fully integrated into the workshop. Roland turned his attention back to Sebastian, the newly awakened tower spirit. With the initial setup complete, it was time to test some of the more advanced functionalities. This construct didn't have access to any functional parts of this place, nor could it control any of the golems. For the time being, it would be granted access to the teleportation gate and be connected to the Institute. Sebastian needed to go through many tests first before he could be given access to everything. Sebastian, initiate a diagnostic check of all connected systems and report any anomalies. Initiating diagnostic check. Please stand by, Master. The orb of light, now known as Sebastian, began to pulse rhythmically. Roland watched the screens as lines of runic script and data scrolled by, the advanced graphical interface providing a clear view of the system status. It was a mesmerizing display of magical technology at work, and something that Roland was proud of. Everything's going smoothly so far, While Sebastian is running the diagnostic check, why don't we work on the gate? Aye boss. Bernier nodded, and the two began the assembly. Just as before, Roland had ordered the Union dwarves to assemble the parts beforehand. Having a fully functioning company filled with blacksmiths was quite handy, and thanks to his status as Knight Commander, they needed to prioritize his orders over others. They moved away from the center of the workshop, where Sebastian's brain was housed. The gate would be close by, in a separate smaller chamber for now. Roland planned to expand the scale of this entire underground magical smithy later on. Once Sebastian was fully operational, it would be possible to use specialized construction golems to handle the work of city craftsmen. Roland was cautious about revealing the knowledge of the layout of this underground area to anyone. By not showing it to any outsiders, he minimized the potential threat. Let's start with the base. Make sure it's aligned properly, Bernier. We don't want any mishaps during the first activation. Soon, the two were busy at work, and the gate quickly took shape. Roland was ecstatic at the pace they were progressing. The most challenging part of the construction had already been completed. The teleportation gate was nothing more than another runic machine that functioned like any other and wouldn't pose any problems in the future. The real challenge would be getting Sebastian to operate it, but considering the speed he was showcasing, things were progressing well. Master, I completed the diagnostic check. Oh. Roland was surprised at the arrival of the glowing sphere in the side chamber. That was quick, Sebastian. Any anomalies detected? Negative, Master. All systems are functioning within normal parameters. Good work, Sebastian. Stand by for further instructions. With that, Sebastian hovered in the corner of the chamber, awaiting Roland's next command. Roland felt a sense of satisfaction at the efficiency of his artificial spirit. It seemed that he would have some extra time on his hands. If everything is proceeding this quickly, I might actually be able to create the rune Mark II or at least make a more advanced rune Mark I. Arghhhhhhhh. Ugh. And nu. That doesn't sound like a goblin or a hobgoblin. Roland, together with a maid who had orange cat ears, walked through a darkened corridor. In the distance, he could hear strange shouts indicating someone in a lot of distress. The woman next to him clearly knew what was happening but didn't seem perturbed by the screams. The shouts grew louder as they progressed, and eventually, the maid, Mary, spoke out. Since your return, we have noticed an increase in suspicious individuals. Suspicious individuals? Could they be from information guilds or perhaps? Mary stopped the moment he asked about the origins of the shouts, and to his surprise, she took something out. She held it out to him, and at first glance, it looked like nothing more than a simple bracelet. It was mostly black with a bird insignia that resembled a raven on it. However, to Roland, this was more than a simple bracelet, as he could instantly identify it as a magical item. This has quite a strong concealment enchantment on it, anyone wearing it would have their true status hidden. Roland took the bracelet from Mary, inspecting it closely. His eyes narrowed as he detected the subtle yet sophisticated concealment enchantment. There were several layers of hidden runes that would even challenge Tier 3 class holders. An expert on Arian's level would be needed to even see a problem, and most others would need to examine it directly and closely to notice anything unusual. Such a runic enchantment isn't easy to come by. Whoever is using these has access to some serious resources. Mary nodded and replied quickly as the two walked towards the groaning sounds. These individuals have been sneaking around Albrook, and we found these bracelets on them. The shouts you hear now are from one of those we captured. The intricate concealment runes on the bracelet indicated a high level of craftsmanship and knowledge. Something like this wasn't cheap and far beyond what a common thief or spy would possess. This suggested that a well-backed group was behind it. Various groups could be responsible, but Roland suspected someone nearby. Considering that he had just caused a scene in another noble's territory, his guess was likely correct. Do we know anything about their identity and objectives? Not yet. The interrogation is ongoing, but they're tight-lipped. Whoever they are, they've been trained to resist questioning. Luckily we know of a group that uses the Raven as a calling card. Let me guess, Theodore. Mary nodded. Ah, are you familiar with the Ravens? Not exactly, I heard a few rumors here and there, but nothing too specific. Mary nodded again, and they continued forward without her going into much detail about these so-called Ravens. Roland had been given all the information Arthur possessed and had also used information guilds through the Thieves' Guild. This organization was similar to what Mary's maids were turning into, the eyes and ears of the noble. This wasn't anything new. Nobles were, in a sense, required to establish their own spy network if they ever wanted to achieve anything substantial. The person that had been caught was probably here to investigate the strange mage who had rescued some slaves. He had caused quite a scene in Aldbourne, which exposed the state of their army. Now that they presented themselves as a proper threat, their enemies were probably trying to gather as much information as they could. While the Valyrian Duke frowned on any assassination attempts among nobles, he would likely let it slide if there was no proof of the deed. Because of this reason, Mary was taking this situation quite seriously, and the screams of the unknown man were proof of its seriousness. He probably possessed valuable information that could help her protect Arthur better, but extracting anything from him would likely prove challenging. They are probably trying to figure out the extent of Arthur's forces. Do you think they are aiming for something else? They might just be testing us or trying to provoke a response. Testing? I see. Roland nodded, finding sense in Mary's assessment. The man they had captured could have been a lure set by Theodore and his group. Once their own spies and agents were sent in, he would capture them to extract information. It was a tactic occasionally used, where the spies sent in to be captured often lacked valuable information. As they approached the cell, it became increasingly evident that this individual was not going to divulge any secrets easily. Arghhhh. Uh-oh, get down. A familiar voice called out to him from within the cell, and he instantly conjured a shield of mana. It arrived just in time to intercept the spray of blood hurtling their way. The blood splattered against the barrier, revealing inside the cell the lower half of a man's body slumping forward. It appeared the prisoner had imploded from within, likely triggered by a magical safeguard to prevent him from disclosing any critical information. The two of them stood in shock as they witnessed the gruesome aftermath of the prisoner's demise. The man's lower body lay limp against the floor of the cell, blood dripping down in a macabre display. The cell itself was now splattered with crimson along with the person that was performing the interrogation. It stinks. Gianna, the person Roland was supposed to meet today to conclude his prosthesis research, was the one who caught the brunt of the explosion. In her hands, he could see a metallic tray that she had used to shield her face from the gory blast. On the ground lay various sharp objects like knives, scissors, and pliers, which were likely on the tray she had been holding. Gianna, are you all right? Mary rushed in to aid Gianna, but Roland's attention remained fixated on the remains of the supposed spy. He had heard of volatile magical contracts before, but this situation surpassed anything he knew. The closest comparison he could draw was to the parasitic abyssal worms people were previously implanted with. His mana senses confirmed his suspicions. Instead of regular mana, he detected cursed hexes permeating the area. I'm sure the Duke wouldn't approve of cursed magics, but not like Arthur would be able to pin anything on him, even with a recording. Oh, Knight Commander! You're already here? Sorry about this, give me some time to freshen up. The woman didn't seem too shaken up by all the gore and chunks of matter permeating the area. Roland was starting to wonder where these maids were coming from. Was there some hidden ninja maid village where young girls were being trained in the ways of assassination and espionage? It's fine, take your time, I'm just here to examine the last few specimens and how they reacted to the transplantation effort. He replied while turning towards Mary, who was examining the remains. This looks like a blast worm. Blast worm? Roland inquired while Many poked something that looked like a leg from some type of insect. They are used by witch doctors or warlocks and can be implanted into people's bodies. It's quite a common practice in assassination guilds. I see, I assume once the host attempts to disclose restricted information, the worm is triggered. Oh, have you heard of them? Not this one in particular, but I've heard of others like it. They weren't supposed to be this flashy. It seems as if Theodore is trying to send us a message. That could be true, but it might also be a warning directed at the other ravens. Failure is not accepted. Hey. Mary nodded as the two tried to assess the situation. Either Theodore was trying to make a flashy entrance to warn Arthur about visiting his lands further, or it was just to remind the other assassins that they would die a miserable death, if they failed like this person. Nevertheless, now they needed to focus on bolstering their city defenses and increasing the security measures, which in Roland's opinion, wouldn't be that hard. First mind-controlling parasites and now exploding worms. Roland looked at the remains and performed an examination with the help of his armor. He hoped to identify the worms by their mana pattern, but it seemed to have vanished along with their host. His gear was attuned to the mana patterns of both people and monsters. In theory, it would be possible to build a detection device for these small beings, but there would be some constraints. Could you lend me this for now? The bracelet? Yes, if I can study it, I should be able to pinpoint similar ones within the city. Instead of focusing on the small monster, he changed his target. These worms were tiny, and their mana signature would be extremely hard to detect once inside a human body. It was the same with the abyssal worms, which were only detected due to their adverse reaction to holy mana. On the other hand, the bracelet was a runic artifact, something he specialized in. It wouldn't take long for him to unearth all its intricacies. Just like the abyssal cult, it was likely that the runesmith creating these bracelets was merely copying designs, which would make them easier to crack. How about the blasting worms? I could try looking into it, but I can't promise anything. It will probably require the target to be quite close, maybe even in direct skin contact or more. That's fine. We'll just relocate them into a private room for a more thorough examination if someone acts suspiciously. Mary nodded seriously, and Roland returned the gesture. He was responsible for controlling the monitoring system around the city. With Sebastian now operational, his plan was to eventually delegate this task to the tower spirit. Sebastian had ample processing power and could probably eventually scan the entire city for abnormalities. Covering the entire area would be improbable, but setting up critical checkpoints was feasible. If they could get spies to pass through these checkpoints without realizing they were being scanned, it would suffice. Excuse me, Knight Commander, I was not expecting you so soon. Now where were we? Ah yes, the hobgoblins. Once the issue with the enemy infiltrator was resolved, Gianna returned in a fresh-made uniform. This underground area was becoming akin to a peculiar noble's dungeon, which Roland found ironic. Arthur appeared to be someone who didn't entirely embrace noble traditions, yet any respectable aristocrat maintained one of these hidden lairs. In this case, suspicious tests on monsters were already underway, and people were being held hostage without the city's knowledge, leaving Roland uncertain about how to feel. How are the test subjects performing? Are the goblins still acting the same? Well, yes. They don't seem to like their new limbs and eventually just gnaw through them, but the hobgoblins are a bit smarter. Roland peeked into one of the holding cells where several regular green goblins were housed. They had been outfitted with replacement golemic arms, which were now discarded on the ground with the flesh they were attached to bitten through. The small green monsters seemed unwilling to accept the artificial limbs as their own. Despite the failure, this data was valuable, it allowed him to examine how well the arms integrated with the monsters. The fact that they needed to use their teeth to remove the limbs hinted at a promising aspect of the experiment. Moving on to another cell, Roland was introduced to the hobgoblin specimen. This one was actively trying to use its magical hand, which had been attuned to its spiritual mana pattern. The process was relatively smooth, but despite being attuned, the arm was quite jittery. This was due to its limited functionality as the hobgoblin's original arm had superior stats and capabilities. The magical arm clearly lagged behind the hobgoblin's intentions, resulting in noticeable delays. Once this delay was in place, the signal was interrupted and resulted in a faulty movement output. This one looks promising, guide it to the test chamber, I'll wait for it there. As you wish, Commander. The monster's replacement arm looked promising, and Roland decided it was ready for one last test. This test would be conducted in a small chamber with sturdy walls and 2 entrances. Roland entered through one entrance while the hobgoblin was pushed in through the other. Instantly, the monster identified Roland as an enemy and charged toward him with its new metallic arm raised. The hobgoblin swung its arm at him, and Roland swiftly dodged the wide swing to the side. His intention was not to defeat the hobgoblin but merely to observe how it used its new hand in combat. The monster showed no inhibitions or instincts to protect the artificial limb, providing Roland with the data he needed. Roland observed closely, noting how the arm responded to the hobgoblin's commands. Despite the initial jitteriness, the arm's movements gradually became smoother as the hobgoblin grew more accustomed to controlling it. Eventually, the jittering started to subside as if the monster adjusted to the slower output. Is the soul adjusting to the limb or is the monster's natural instinct? Just like with the others, it's slowly adapting to it. He continued to record the hobgoblin's movements and the magical fluctuations around the arm as the test progressed. Eventually, Roland tossed an iron short sword to the hobgoblin. The monster swiftly grabbed the weapon with its organic hand and activated one of its skills, enhancing the power of its swings. This went against his plan, and after dodging a few attacks, Roland pointed his finger to produce a thin energy flame. The enraged hobgoblin continued to attack, but this thin flame passed through its organic arm. The limb fell to the ground, and the magical flames instantly cauterized the wounds to prevent the monster from bleeding out. Now with only its prosthetic limb remaining, Roland waited patiently for it to attack again. The monster didn't look good, but it grabbed the iron blade with its metallic arm and charged at Roland once more. Roland stayed calm, allowing the monster to swing at him repeatedly. Sometimes he dodged, and other times he intercepted the blade with his own arm. Despite the monster's efforts, it lacked the power to cause even a scratch on him. Eventually, Roland concluded the test as he realized it had been successful. Good, this will be enough. It just took a little wave of his hand to send the monster's head flying to the side. The monster was dead and he approached its motionless body to retrieve the prosthetic limb for later study. With this, he had all that he needed to complete Bernier's arm. I confirmed that it's possible to use skills even with these artificial limbs. The soul seems quite adaptive, as if it's just a mold to be shaped. After a momentary pause, Roland retreated from the chamber, leaving it to the maid to care for the monsters. Now free to proceed, he reflected on Rastix's remarkable discovery with this regent. The gnome had not only perfected a potion that could splice flesh and metal together but also ensured the process was reversible, restoring the flesh to its original state after fusion. With all this confirmed, Roland proceeded confidently with the assembly of the prosthesis socket. Once in place, attaching the new arm and ensuring it functioned like the original would be straightforward. With this amount of adaptivity, Bernier's arm could have multiple uses. It wouldn't just need to be an arm but an actual artifact tool. While walking home to share the good news with his assistant, Roland began contemplating the possibilities of this new invention. Restoring the arm meant it could be configured to match a person's natural body output, but it could also go further. There was potential to install simple spells for everyday tasks as well as combat enhancements. Since the arm attachment was the only permanent addition, the possibilities seemed boundless. Making multiple separate prosthetic arms could be costly. Perhaps it would be better to make them more modular? An inside plate that holds various spell types could eliminate the need to replace the entire hand. Those puppet golem digits aren't that easy to recreate. Let's put the emitting rune on the palm or perhaps on the upper hand portion. As Roland approached his home, he pondered that with everything almost settled, it was time to complete this project which held boundless future possibilities, not just for those who had lost their limbs, but potentially for many others as well. It was something that could very well change the whole kingdom or perhaps the world. My lord. Enter. A man wearing a butler uniform stepped into the opulent office of Theodore Valerian. The room was adorned with rich, dark wood paneling and deep, crimson drapes that framed tall, narrow windows. The air was thick with the scent of aged books and polished leather. Theodore sat behind a grand mahogany desk, cluttered with various documents and arcane artifacts. The butler slowly approached the desk with measured steps, carrying a silver tray with a lone letter on it. Reginald, did you bring the report? Yes, my lord. Reginald nodded respectfully and presented a sealed letter resting on the tray. The seal bore a dark crimson raven insignia. This seal was magical in nature and could only be opened when Theodore brought his ring, which had a matching bird, to it. Both magical artifacts began to flash, and the wax started to melt. Once the wax had dissolved, the noble quickly scanned through the letter, a frown adorning his face. Interesting. Theodore murmured, setting the letter down and tapping his fingers thoughtfully on the desk. He looked up at Reginald, who stood waiting with the disciplined patience of a seasoned retainer. What is that bastard planning? He is starting to become a thorn in my side. The man continued to tap his finger while contemplating the matter at hand. His brother had begun growing in power recently, but it was not to the point of him becoming a valid threat. In Theodore's opinion, even Ivan was still a much bigger threat than an upstart bastard with one city. However, it was best to tackle issues before they had time to fester and rot. He knew this truth but could not act hasty, as he was not just going against a singular opponent. Reginald, what do we know about this so-called Knight Commander Wayland? The butler bowed slightly, his expression revealing nothing but a calm efficiency. I must apologize, but not much is known about this man. We have done extensive background checks on this individual, but no one by this name seemed to have existed. A fake name then? That is what we can assume, my lord. Theodore's eyes narrowed as he considered the implications. A man with such expertise and unknown origins could become a threat, especially if he was aligned with one of his brothers. It's possible that he is just a diversion. Could Julius be pulling the strings? Or could he be someone else's man? The tapping on the desk continued to intensify as the noble contemplated the issue. The idea that Arthur was capable of handling such a competent retainer was far-fetched. It was more likely that one of his 3 other brothers was trying to divert his focus from other matters. The man called Wayland was probably hired to quickly raise Albrook up and force him to relegate manpower there. If this was true, then attempting to bribe the man would be pointless. Either they would need to kill him or avoid partaking in this game his other brothers were trying to play. Knight Commander Wayland appears to be highly skilled in magical combat. His skills and classes are unknown, but we can assume that it's a profession involving runes and artifacts. Something akin to a rune mage is most probable. However, we can't discount him having a rare special class. Theodore leaned back and continued to listen to all the information about Knight Commander Wayland. He knew well about rune mages, and considering the increase in runic artifacts within Albrook, it made sense. However, they didn't have enough information, and the appearance of a strange magician in one of the border cities complicated things further. Not enough. My lord. There is just not enough information, but we can't keep ignoring this upstart. We will send the 3rd Raven unit, the 1st and 2nd will continue with their tasks. I want to know what that brother of mine is doing and who is truly behind this. My lord, the 3rd Raven unit will be deployed immediately. Reginald acknowledged with a bow. He turned on his heel, departing swiftly to relay Theodore's orders. The sound of the heavy wooden door closing behind him seemed to echo Theodore's thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight that cast dancing shadows across the room. He couldn't afford to underestimate any potential threats, but he also couldn't let something like this distract him. This was clearly a ruse created by one of his other brothers, and he couldn't let himself fall into their trap. He would do the bare minimum to contain this problem, but still focus on his true opponents. Back in Albrook, Roland was putting the final touches on Bernier's prosthetic arm. His workshop was buzzing with noise as there was a new addition to it. The finished prosthetic arm lay on a wooden workbench, gleaming under runic light hanging from the above ceiling. The arm had a silvery luster to it, and the intricate runes were quite noticeable, but focused mainly on the forearm portion. Is it getting hot in here, boss? Not really. Just relax and take a seat. We will start the procedure soon. Roland proclaimed and pointed to a large metallic chair with various straps. Bernier was visibly nervous but trusting in Roland's expertise. He hesitated for a moment, but right before making up his mind, someone smacked him on the back. What are you dilly-dallying for, young man? Just get on the chair. Do you not trust in my genius? Bernier looked back to where the strike came from and spotted a shorter man with a long beard. It was Rastix the alchemist, who had not been working here for long. He had been given access to the underground workshop to help with the procedure. It was this gnome who had created the concoction, and he constantly liked to remind everyone of it. After chuckling nervously, Bernier eventually moved over to the chair. He had previously used a different prosthesis, which had been held in place by an exterior harness. This procedure would fuse his flesh with a metallic frame that would securely hold the arm in place. The procedure had been tested on monsters, and he had been present during the initial round of testing. However, despite the promising data, it didn't change the fact that this was uncharted territory for all of them. Bernier would be the first person to undergo it, and the lack of experience on their part was what made him nervous. All right, Bernier, we are going to start soon, are you ready? Let's do it, boss. Okay, drink the potion, and let's do it. Once Bernier had drunk a vial and taken a seat, Roland started strapping his arm into a previously prepared frame. This part would cover the partial forearm stump completely. Bernier's arm needed to be secured to a nearby bench next to the chair he was sitting on. The procedure was delicate, and any movement could disrupt the alignment of the prosthesis frame. Once he was secured to both the chair and the side bench, the process could then continue. Rastix. I'm on it. The gnome alchemist wasn't here just to watch, he had a role to play as well. Above the secured arm, a bucket-sized crucible was hanging, containing the alchemical concoction that needed just one last ingredient. During their research, they discovered that this reagent would lose most of its adhesive properties within a few hours of being made, and within the first few minutes, its effects were magnified. It was best to produce it directly during the operation for the best possible outcome. The arm frame, which also contained a mold for the adhesive, would be lowered down, and through specially prepared needles, it would flow into the arm more thoroughly. It was a delicate process, but after testing it on multiple hobgoblins and goblins, they were confident that it was safe. Thus, the time came, and soon Rastix drew the lever to lower the crucible. The alchemical mixture, shimmering with a faint darkened silver glow, began to flow down the thin tubes into the mold around Bernier's partial forearm. The gnome adjusted the flow carefully, ensuring that the adhesive spread evenly without any spills or leaks. After another level which was lowered by Roland, the needles punctured through Bernier's arm. The previously taken potion acted as a pain anesthetic and allowed no pain to flow through during this procedure. Slow and steady. Rastix murmured with satisfaction as the process unfolded. He observed everything with glee while Roland meticulously analyzed each step. His keen eyes focused on the connection between the metal and fusing flesh, ensuring that none of the crucial runic traces within the attachment would be compromised. It was a slow process, but there were no failures observed, and eventually, it was completed successfully. So, how does it feel? A little numb. Roland began unstrapping Bernier and his arm from the contraption he had assembled. The frame mold that had covered the arm sleeve could now be removed. Once taken off, it revealed a silvery attachment that extended up to the elbow. However, the arm was not yet fully integrated, as it still needed to be inserted into the freshly created prosthesis socket. Once inserted, it would be activated and securely held in place by magnetic runes in addition to the existing structural support. Try to move your elbow around first, see if you feel any discomfort. The potion should wear off soon. Bernier cautiously flexed his elbow, testing the range of movement. There was a slight stiffness initially, but as he continued to move, the prosthetic socket was kept in place and eventually they could continue with the process. Roland grabbed the ready prosthetic arm from the nearby table and bright it forth, its silvery luster indicating that it had a high concentration of mithril in it. I would have been fine with a regular alloy, boss, isn't this a bit too much? Nonsense, mithril is both resistant to runic deterioration and light. If you're worried about it being stolen, we can dip it in some coating later. He spared no expense on the runic prosthesis, ensuring it was of the highest quality. While red mithril was known for its fire resistance, he opted for a more regular kind that was uniform in all aspects for this arm. It wasn't just intended for crafting and it was sturdy enough to withstand the heat Bernier typically worked with already. Soon, it was inserted in and once the runes were activated it held in place quite steady. Try activating it with your mana just like any other runic appliance. Bernier focused his mana into the prosthetic arm, concentrating on his intent to move it. Slowly, the fingers twitched, responding to his mental commands. He continued to test each finger's movement, feeling the delicate precision allowed by the intricate runes embedded within the arm. Roland observed closely, noting everything and making sure that the spiritual mana flowed without any issues. Looks like it's working smoothly. How does it feel? Is this really a fake arm? Bernier replied, stunned. He could see the plethora of glowing runes along with the intricate patterns over the forearm. Once the potion wore off and he regained the feeling of touch, the real shock set in. The replacement he had been given felt as if it belonged to his own body, much more so than the other runic arm he had previously used. It's a bit tingly and faint but, I can feel it again. Boss, I can feel my fingers. Congratulations, the use of the previous prosthesis must have attuned your spiritual mana to this one faster. If I'm not mistaken, you should eventually regain full sensation in the arm over time. Just take it easy for now, don't try to overexert yourself. The integration process will continue for a while as your body gets used to the new limb. You will probably continue to feel this strange tingling sensation for a while but it should subside eventually. If it doesn't we'll have to perform some more tests. Bernier nodded enthusiastically, his eyes fixed on the marvel before him. He flexed the fingers again, marveling at the dexterity and responsiveness of the prosthetic arm. Thank you, boss. This is beyond anything I expected. Ahem. Just as Bernier was having a moment with Roland, someone interrupted them by clearing his throat behind them. Once they looked at Rastix that was there he raised his nose up, as if he was waiting for something. Aren't you forgetting something? Thank you Mr. Rastix, this wouldn't have been possible without your help. It surely wouldn't. The gnome started chuckling, as if he were the main reason for the success, while Bernier nodded awkwardly. Roland, on the other hand, focused on the gathered data, listening to his tower spirit, Sebastian, who was communicating with him through his helmet. His AI was tasked with analyzing the data and, perhaps in the future, replicating this process without Roland's direct involvement. Now that Roland's understanding of runic technology had reached this level, it wouldn't be far-fetched for him to begin automating some of the processes he had been forced to perform manually. As long as Sebastian was given the data and a tool or golemic body to control, he would probably be able to recreate the same process. The tough part was still a way to recreate the rune crafting process that was locked behind skills but he had an idea to tackle it. Bernier, take the rest of the day off, cover your arm with this sleeve for now until we can make something better. Bernier was handed a long leather glove to cover the silvery prosthesis. He didn't need to be seen walking around with it in the city. The glove wasn't quite form-fitting and needed to be strapped on at the upper arm portion, but for now, it was fine. In the future, he planned on replacing it with something similar to the silver-grey suit he used for his armor. Boss, and thank you again. No need to thank me, once you're done recovering you'll have a lot more work to do. Roland removed his helmet, revealing a big grin. Bernier flinched at the sight, realizing that soon he would need to increase his productivity. Eventually, he and Rastix left, but the gnome continued to act smugly about the new invention. He didn't wish to ruin the man's mood now, but eventually, he would need to remind Rastix about the contents of their contract. The gnome probably wouldn't be this happy when he realized that the rights to the prosthesis and the adhesive all belonged to Roland. Finally, that's over. I just hope that there won't be any complications. The process is simple enough, so applying it to other people without my help is feasible, which leaves me with one last thing to decide on. Once he was alone in his workshop, Roland headed to his private research room. On a workbench to the side, there were numerous golemic arms, remnants of his initial tests and research. Some had been retrieved from goblins, while others had never made it onto a live subject. Then on the other side was a rather strange-looking contraption that he started approaching. Two metallic arms dangled from the setup, connected to something that looked like a thick metallic ring. In the middle of the ring was a thick pole, to which the ring was connected by 4 metallic rods. These arms included both the upper arm and forearm areas, and they sprang to life as Roland approached. Once the strange limb creation was activated, it started to mimic its creator's posture. When he raised one of his arms, the metallic arm moved up as well. If he turned around, the ring moved with his motions. After a moment, he sent a few punches flying forward, and the machine mirrored his movements at almost the same speed. What should I do with this technology, and how big can I make this? Not far from this apparatus with arms stood a recently repaired runic machine. It was the large harness golem with clawed hands that Bernier had used when the abyssal cultists appeared. This golem also began to mirror Roland's movements and could even move forward in tandem with his steps. With something like this, even a farmer could start killing monsters. The golem was deactivated and soon he moved over to a schematic. There a few detailed drawings of runic armors and armaments were present. There was still a week left for him and perhaps there was some time to make some upgrades.